Hi everyone, and welcome to this video today where I have a very special guest. I'll be talking to Mr. Kanthan Pillay, well-known South African journalist, business leader, and academic. So Mr. Pillay, a very warm welcome. Thanks for giving us some of your time today.
Thanks for having me, Devesh. Good to be here.
Excellent. So Mr. Pillay, many South Africans know you as a journalist and business leader, but I'm very interested. You have a background in the technology space, which many people don't know about. Don't you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Look, it's one of those things that I think that, frankly, any business leader who's around today needs to have some sort of understanding of the technology space. But in my case, it was just a question of being in the right place at the right time. Because when I went to the US in 1986 on a scholarship to Princeton at the time, one of the requirements of the scholarship was that you needed to have employment so that you could pay for things that weren't covered by the scholarship. So for example, things like, well, pocket money for one, being able to pay for your own textbooks was another, any extracurricular activities was a third. And I was holding down a range of jobs at the time. So one of them was working in food services at the university, which basically meant that you were scrubbing pots and pans and all of that type of stuff, and serving food, of course. And I worked as a bartender at a restaurant in the city. And then I got a job at the University Computer Center. And I walked in there one morning, and the woman who was running the place, Rita Saltz was her name, was first in at the office, sitting at the back. And I said, I'd like to work here. And she said, well, what do you know about this stuff? And I said, well, absolutely nothing. And she said, well, what can you do? And I said, well, pretty much anything. Just give me time. And she said, well, when can you start? And I said, tomorrow morning is good for me. And she said, I'll see you at 8 o'clock. And I happened to be there at the birth of the internet, really speaking, because at that time, there were 3 IP addresses in all of Princeton University.
Wow.
Now, to put that in perspective, Princeton now has a range of Class B subnets, which, literally we are talking about millions of potential devices just on the Princeton campus alone. But at the time, as I said, there were 3 IP addresses. I was lucky enough to get in there when a range of things that we thought possible today just were not even conceived of. So one of the first things that I did was to hook up a Macintosh computer to the IBM mainframe. Okay. Just simply because I had met this Macintosh computer, which at that time was running off 2 floppy disk drives. I wanted to be able to produce publications that had a more substantial amount of information than could be contained on 2 floppy disk drives. And there was this IBM mainframe computer with what to me at the time was mountains of disk space available. And my logic was, let's get these to work together. So file servers as a concept at the time actually did not exist. So it was a pretty groundbreaking thing. And that actually ended up suddenly becoming a career for me, because I ended up playing with lots of cutting edge technology that the science in terms of what is being taught at the Department of Computer Science had not yet come to terms with it, because academia generally plays catch up in terms of technology. Right. I worked in the program in applied and computational mathematics, which was mainly doing very complicated calculations, primarily for the US Department of Defense. We had a new piece of technology called the Intel Hypercube, which was basically 32 i860 processors in a single cabinet. And each of those i860 processors, they were floating point units, and they would do very fast floating point calculations. At that time, roughly half the speed of a Cray YMP, which was the fastest supercomputer in the world at the time. Right. And I figured out how to get this thing to work. The result of that was that we ended up beating the rest of the country to a Department of Defense grant. At the time, it was a $4 million grant for the program in applied and computational mathematics.
Did you need special security clearance? Did you need any special...
Say that again?
Did you need any special security clearances to work on such a project?
Look, you see, the interesting thing in terms of the way in which the DoD runs these projects is they never really tell you what the end goal is going to be. So all they're really asking you for is to do a particular calculation and with various parameters. So for example, they would come to us and they would say, calculate the turbulence along a structure that is operating at a particular depth with particular pressures. And we take a look at this and we'd say, they are putting this out as though it's a submarine fin, but in fact, we can see that this is meant to be on an aircraft, but that's okay. We're just here to do the calculation. And so, but, having said that, I used to work very closely with the people who were briefing us at the Department of Defense. I used to go across to Fort Monmouth, which is where those scientists were based quite often. And that pretty much drive in. I'd, wave my driver's license. They'd clearly done their security clearance on me beforehand and all of that type of stuff.
I think,
But,
yeah, sorry. I think a lot of us who were into computers, myself from the 90s, we tend to look back and romanticize as those being the good old days of tech. Do you agree?
Look, I don't think it's a question of good old days. I think what is true is that at the time, it was a lot more accessible for someone getting into the field for the first time. Problem that we have today is that the sheer volume of knowledge that one needs to have to get into anything in the IT space is massive. I mean, you consider where I'm sitting right now. So, effectively starting off in 1986 up until today. And there's a massive slew of knowledge that I've acquired during that time. But it's not enough for me to actually stay on top of what's needed to be at the top of the game today. So you need to end up specializing. You can no longer be a generalist at the level that I was when I got past the starting post.
Yeah, very true. And I think that problem is actually accelerating. If you look at things like AI, data science.
Well, again, this is stuff that was kind of predicted. Philip K. Dick, a very famous science fiction author, I'm sure you've come across him. So, he's known for things like, well, Total Recall, as an example, was based on one of his short stories. Blade Runner was based on one of his books, which was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Yes.
And so I was really into Philip K. Dick when I was, a kid, around about 12 years old. I was lapping up his stuff. And one of the things that he predicted was that human beings would become so specialized that the ability for people to be able to hop between various disciplines would disappear altogether. So, and this actually has relevance if you look in terms of where we are right now with the COVID stuff. And I know you want to talk about COVID later on, but I just want to pull these pieces together because we have everyone focusing on what the epidemiologists are saying without considering that actually humanity lives in what's essentially a complex system. And the complex system is not only dependent upon the life cycle of human beings as predicted by the epidemiologists, but also by the economics that drive that entire structure and a range of those other things that come together. And if you consider it only from one piece of the puzzle, you are not actually going to be able to take into account that which comes from other factors that contribute to this complex system. And of course, politicians having zero knowledge of any of these fields are the worst people to be doing this. But yeah, but going back to the computer science thing. So as a result of this contract that we ended up getting, there was a visiting Italian scientist who said, hey, this is really great. We're setting up a research center in Sardinia. Why don't you come and set it up for us?
Wow.
And so at that time, I was faced with either starting a career on Wall Street because I had a very nice job offer from Solomon Brothers. They'd offered me a $40,000 signing bonus at the time, which was, huge. Or I had this thing about going to a Mediterranean island that I knew nothing about. So guess what I chose?
Well, I think that would have been around the Wall Street crash. So perhaps the right...
No, the Wall Street crash was very quick. Remember, Wall Street crash was in 1989, and the markets recovered very quickly from it. People tend to forget that. If everyone who lost their shirts during the Wall Street crash had actually just sat back and done absolutely nothing, they would have been fine.
Right, right. Before we
Yeah.
move on, do you find time to still keep up to the tech world today?
Well, it depends on what you mean by keep up. Obviously, I'm always looking out for where tech is moving and where the next opportunities are likely to come from. I still, code my own websites and that kind of stuff.
Right.
I'm spending a lot of time now poring around um, trading bots, primarily to play in the cryptocurrency space, but not at the level of actually making use of them right now. But I'm just trying to get my head around where the opportunities are to be doing things in that space.
I want to ask you
So at
about
that,
that
yeah,
a bit later when we talk global macroeconomics.
sure. But yeah, I suppose keeping up to speed on it. Well, I, right now I've got money that's invested outside the country, and it's primarily in tech stocks.
Right.
So I obviously watch that very carefully. So while there's a very strong, um, shall I say, propensity to just stay with the safe stuff. So which is basically Facebook, Apple, Netflix, um, Google, the FANG stocks as they're called.
Yeah.
I'm still looking at where the next leap is going to be in tech. Where's the next Uber coming from?
Yeah.
That type of stuff.
The next disruptor, basically. So
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah. Thanks for that. So I want to talk now more in the present and the current state of the world. We've suffered for almost a year with this COVID pandemic. We've been hit economically. And of course, people have died in this country and around the world. Um, does the vaccine trigger an end to this, or are we still too early to be expecting anything that optimistic in your view?
Yeah, the problem with predicting the future is that if we were able to do that, a lot of us would be rich.
Yeah,
Look, I think that the vaccines are an important first step. And I think if you look particularly in the South African context, we've dropped the ball spectacularly.
yeah,
Our government has been just completely idiotic in terms of the way in which we've done this. What should really have happened is that anyone should have been allowed to import the vaccines. The first thing that would have happened is that all of the medical aid companies would immediately have funded the import of the vaccine.
yeah.
Because if you consider this, the money that the medical aid companies need to spend on giving vaccinations to every single one of their members free of charge is significantly less than what it would cost to hospitalize everyone who's on a hospital plan.
But then to
So
be
just from
fair,
a
sorry, to be fair, what about the millions of South Africans who are not covered by any type of medical aid? How would it work to get the vaccine to them?
well, that's government's job, isn't it? But the entire idea of saying that the private sector is not allowed to do it and only the government is allowed to do it means that effectively what you are doing is taking the breadwinners of the country, the most economically active sector of the country, which are the people who are sitting with medical aid, and telling them to get in line based on some arbitrary decision that gets taken by some flunky in government. And you have to understand that this is a government that's not able to keep computers working at Home Affairs. They're not able to keep the lights on. And we're trusting them to be able to successfully vaccinate us? I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's not a question of either or. Yes, we should be caring about the masses, but remember that our duty as human beings is first and foremost to take care of our families.
yeah. Lockdowns, your view on lockdowns?
Lockdowns don't work. It's very clear that lockdowns don't work. Then education is a far more significant determinant in terms of how you get people to actually deal with this. So, for example, when we move from the most restrictive levels to where we are right now, did I end up modifying my behavior significantly? The answer is no. I'm still not going out to restaurants. I'm still not going to go hanging out at pubs. I'm still not going to large gatherings. My parents are still mainly housebound, so I do, most of the shopping that's involved because it's a sensible thing to do. And really what should be happening is that the economy should be set as free as we possibly can. And all of the vulnerable groups really should be protected. So, if you're diabetic, then you need to stay away from any potential infection risks. If you happen to be over the age of, it's a moving target now, but, let's say late 40s onwards, take more precautions than you would for your kids. All of that type of stuff. I really don't get where this desire to force particular streams of activity to succeed while others fail comes from. But again, it goes back to our earlier point. When you lack a fundamental understanding of what's necessary to keep everything working and how to make money, things are going to fall apart.
Yeah. So a more sensible approach would have been preferred. So that's a good segue into talking about the economic situation. And I want to rewind back, and I think this will be an interesting question to you. In 94, we were the darlings of the world. We had our 15 minutes of fame. There's an argument to be had that perhaps we didn't capitalize on it in terms of developing the economy, positioning ourselves as a location globally for manufacturing, services, basically everything that some Eastern countries have done, and not just Eastern countries around the world that got it right. What is our place as a result in the world in 2021?
You have to understand that you can't see that entire period from 94 to now as monolithic. So if you look in terms of what happened from the period from, let's say, 1994 to 1996, at that stage, we were kind of all over the place. And remember that when we got to, at that stage, we were just about to see the precursor of the Asian crisis. Yeah. But crucially at that point, we didn't really have an economic policy to speak of. We're talking 1994 to 1996. And coming up to 1996 was when Thabo Mbeki, who was effectively running the country at the time, even though Mandela was president, took a very important decision, and that was to drop the Reconstruction and Development Program and instead move it in the direction of GEAR, which was Growth, Empowerment, and Redistribution. The net effect of this was to say all of the social welfare programs that we had planned as the ANC we're tossing out, what we're effectively going to do is to set the economy free and allow business to actually flourish. And the net effect of that was that South Africa then went through the single longest sustained period of growth in its entire history. And the net result of that was that we suddenly had, because our economy was booming, and there were a couple of things that Mbeki instructed Trevor Manuel to do at the time, because remember, Manuel was finance minister. The first thing that he instructed Trevor Manuel to do was to pay back the debt. So we wiped out the national debt completely. We also had tax cuts every single year during that period of time, and the end result of that was that more money flowed back into the economy. But the dividend that then came from paying off the national debt, because remember at the time, paying the national debt was the single biggest item in our budget. I think it was close to about 22, 23% of the budget was going to pay for the national debt. So the dividend that then came from paying off the national debt, Thabo Mbeki then took and plowed that into social grants. And the net impact of plowing that money into social grants was the single biggest transfer of wealth and eradication of poverty that's ever taken place anywhere in the world. Because we had a reduction in terms of living standard measures group 1, LSMs we're talking about here. Over a 5-year period, we had a reduction in LSM 1 of 60%. That meant for every 10 people that you had among the poorest of the poor, 6 of them were lifted out of poverty during that time as a direct result of that social grants. And so it created a virtuous circle.
But then just to recap on that, so it sounds like the initial gear policies were very capitalistic in nature, business friendly. And then we moved to the social grants, which did have an impact, as you said, lifting tremendous amounts of people out of poverty. But then when should that have been pared back? Surely that was not sustainable.
No, you see, I'm actually, it's an interesting scenario out here, but as a capitalist, I'm actually not hostile towards the idea of social grants.
Right.
Because, and in fact, I prefer social grants to the entire idea of government being responsible for being a provider. So the starting point around this is that I think that people generally know how to manage their money better than government does.
Right.
So if you take education as an example, the cost of educating a pupil per year in South Africa right now is roughly 20,000 Rand per pupil per year. So my view is that I would rather take that 20,000 Rand and give that directly to the family of that child, and then allow them to make choices in terms of how their kids get educated. Because right now you have a scenario in many townships around the country where people have been setting up private schools. Why? Because government education is a disaster. So now, just to go back to the question of social grants, if you take that view, that instead of money being poured into the pocket of government, who then spend it on our behalf, pour that money directly, and the entire economy then booms as a result, because people spend money sensibly.
But then,
So,
Mr. I have to ask you on that point. So that's classic demand stimulus by the sounds of things, right? Put money into the hands of people. How do you balance that with increasing tax revenues without impacting business?
well, you don't need to increase tax revenues, because remember at the time, what Mbeki was doing was actually systematically going through tax reductions. And we actually hit a sweet spot, because at the time, when the 2008, 2009 crisis kicked in, remember that we were literally a debt-free country at that point, and we were able to pay social grants out of profits, not out of borrowing. So think of that as a workable business model. And as long as, and remember, the most crucial thing that we need to look at in any society is the sweet spot comes when two numbers correlate. So the first number is population growth. The second number is economic growth. As long as you've got economic growth exceeding population growth, you are growing more prosperous as a country.
Right.
As soon as it switches the other way around, it's a disaster, because it means the country is getting poorer, because the measure of productivity of the country is declining overall.
So then
that's the scenario we're in right now.
That leads me to two very interesting questions. Is GDP the right indicator to measure an economy like South Africa's, firstly?
Well, GDP is probably the most important indicator, because GDP is giving us an indication of whether we're going forward or whether we're going backwards. Now, we have the scenario right now where our population growth is significantly larger than our GDP. As long as it was the other way around, we could still continue smiling. It doesn't really matter how many kids people have, because as long as your economic growth is faster, there's enough money to actually sustain those people. Now we have the scenario where, because the population growth is exceeding the economic growth, it means that every year the amount of money that you're able to pour into uplifting people out of poverty gets spread among a larger number of people, which means therefore that there's less people, which means effectively that we're going backwards. So in fact, if you look at my website, I wrote a piece fairly recently, a couple of thoughts about GDP, which people are welcome to take a look at. So it's a factor, but it should not be the sole factor.
So we can put some links to that article if any of the viewers are interested. But then that brings me to my second question, which is going to be a little bit controversial. We saw a population jump due to factors in surrounding countries. We were highly sympathetic to the situation in Zimbabwe. You know where I'm going with this. We have a politician currently calling for open borders. Is this feasible, to be diplomatic?
we're conflating a couple of things out there. And I think, one of the things that we need to do is to try and separate out what actually makes sense from a matter of national policy and the impact of other things. So firstly, going back in terms of population growth, the one thing that we do know, there are studies around the world that show this, the best way to actually curb population growth is prosperity.
Yeah.
And I cannot say this more clearly, because if you consider that when you're poor and primarily in a rural environment, you have many children because that's your retirement plan.
Yeah.
Because when you can no longer work, you're reliant on each of those children to then give you something at the end of that process. Now, when you have modernized economies where people become more prosperous, we have fewer kids per generation than we've done before. And what that means is that because we have fewer kids, we spend more money on their education, we spend more money on passing on generational wealth. And this happens across the globe. So you'll see now in India, for example, population growth has actually slowed as prosperity has increased. And they've been able to do this without the draconian measures that the Chinese had to do. The Chinese are in trouble at this level, by the way, because of their one-child policy, because it means now that they don't actually have a sufficient volume in terms of a younger generation to continue growing the economy going forward.
Yeah.
But then now let's look at the example that you brought up in terms of open borders. Open borders are great as long as the rules of those open borders apply equally across the board. When you have disproportionate systems in each of those countries, so now consider that we have our court system has taken a decision that anyone who comes into this country as a refugee is entitled to the same rights as a citizen, which means that they are entitled to have access to healthcare, to education, and all of that stuff. That means that you're going to have an influx of people into this country to take advantage of those systems without paying for it. And that becomes a problem. So you can't have open borders are great, but it has to be on the basis of fundamental equality. And that's why the European Union is in as much trouble as it is right now. It's the reason why Brexit happened. It's because, frankly, the British got tired of the fact that you had people flocking from Poland to take advantage of national health benefits that are not available back in their home country.
The NHS.
So, yeah, so none of these things are binary. We can't just say that immigration is bad, open borders are bad. The way to fix people from breeding is to have forced sterilization. No. It's all interconnected, and complex systems, really kind of work that way.
It's very interesting. I want to then move to the economic growth question. Obviously, we went up to 2009, and then we saw deficits increase from 2009 due to various factors. And I don't want to get into the politics of 2009 to 2021. But if you had the ability to reshape our economy tomorrow, let's say you were president you woke up tomorrow morning, you were president. What are the 2 to 3 things, the low-hanging fruit, the easy things to do to make this country more business friendly, to attract foreign investment, and to really get the GDP growth going again?
The first thing that I would fix in this country is public transportation. And I can't say, if there's a single thing that we could do in this country that would make an immediate difference in terms of the lives of the population as a whole, it would be public transportation. And public transportation, you must understand, is very different from what we have today, which is essentially commuter transport,
right,
which is getting people to and from particular routes. When I was in South Korea a few years ago, and I landed in Seoul, and then I went out to Suwon, which is where Samsung's headquarters were. And they are literally 2 separate cities. But the fascinating thing is that the underground railway network um, literally connects the entire country at that level. So I can just hop on a metro train from Seoul and go all the way up to Suwon, quite effortlessly within a short space of time. Why does this stuff become important? It's because the people are living in Seoul, but the jobs happen to be in Suwon. Now, even though you're talking about distances of 60 to 70 kilometers, what it means is that a person who lives in Seoul is able to get their kids off to school and then hop onto a train and get down to work and then come back in time to still spend time with their family in the evening. Now, contrast that with the scenario that we have in our country right now, where there are jobs available in Pretoria. There's a workforce that's available in Soweto. But the only way that people are able to get from Soweto to Pretoria to have access to those jobs is by hopping 4 or 5 minibus taxis in quick succession, which means that effectively they are spending 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening just on commuting. It means that at least 50% of their salary is going towards paying for transportation costs. And that is the single biggest knock-on effect in terms of the overall economy. Plus factor in that those 4 hours a day that could be spent on family time between parents and kids. Again, if you look in terms of social degradation, why do you have breakdown of family structure? It's because of the fact that parents aren't able to spend time with their children in order to infuse generational cultural values in terms of, honesty and integrity and all of those things, which if you have a functional public transportation system, and if you just get that one thing right, everything else kind of flows from that. So one doesn't have to have grandiose plans.
Very interesting.
Consider the sheer amount of money that we're spending right now on SAA, and that money being poured into the transportation system very quickly is going to fix it.
Some would argue that's a different form of transportation, but not the one we're looking
at. It is, yes. But, effectively what we're doing with SAA is we're subsidizing transport for the rich.
Yeah.
Whereas we should be subsidizing transport for the poor. So our government, which claims to have the interests of the poor at heart, has actually got it backwards. So I wouldn't do anything more than that. If there's a single thing that I would say, as president, as my legacy project, I just want to do this one thing. That's what I'd do.
To get people to work affordably, and that has a knock-on.
Because, yes, consider the other things. Okay, for example, why do we have slums? Okay, we can call them informal settlements, okay, but they're essentially squatter camps. They're slums. Call them what they are. And the reason why those things exist is because people move there because they are close to where work opportunities are. Now, if your public transportation system would allow you to live in a place like, I don't know, let's say Ennerdale, which is in the southern part of, which is south of Soweto, basically, and to be able to travel from there to Pretoria in the space of an hour at relatively low cost, why would anyone want to live in a squatter camp out in near Pretoria?
Absolutely.
So there are all of the social ills that get cured based on the ability to move people over vast distances quickly and efficiently.
That's very interesting. So then let me ask you one more question on the local economy and capitalism and business-friendly politics. Now, our political parties generally talk about uplifting the poor. There's always been a move very strong towards communism, socialism. How would you sell capitalism and economic growth to the average disenfranchised South African who perhaps has not heard the right message, who's got a negative image that it's not the right thing, it's for the rich or for a certain group or class, and you've got the opportunity now to sell it to him? How would you do that?
It's a hard one, simply because most people already intrinsically understand what capitalism is all about. And if you think about it, why is Black Friday as hugely successful as it is in our country? And if you look in terms of the things that people buy on Black Friday, it's things like they will go and buy a trolley load of Coke,
Yeah.
as in Coca-Cola, which happens to be on special because it's marked down by 50%.
Just to
And people
confirm,
actually,
Coca-Cola.
yes, Coca-Cola, and people actually understand that this is an opportunity for them to be saving money going forward, and they take advantage of that opportunity. So intrinsically, people know how to manage their own money, and they know how to make money work for them. And we see this in spin-offs in terms of things like Stockfells, as an example. We see it in terms of people understanding the concept of shared transportation. They set up lift clubs. Those are all things that are inherently capitalist in nature. The issue that we have is trying to differentiate between capitalism and crony corporatism. And crony corporatism is a huge problem in this country. In fact, many people who think that South Africa is a capitalist country, actually it isn't. Because if you consider just taking a look at the JSE as an example, there's the 80-20 rule which applies. Well, people should look up the 80-20 rule, by the way, because it applies in lots of, exactly, yes, exactly. But 20% of the shares on the, 20% of the companies on the JSE control 80% of the wealth of the JSE. And they are essentially monopolistic in terms of the way in which they operate, because there's a level of collusion that goes on between all of them, even though it's not overt collusion, which is why you've got a scenario where Cell C is not able to succeed against a backdrop of those two giants of Vodacom and MTN. It's why you have a scenario where new players trying to enter the market are effectively squashed down by the larger players that get out there. Consider banking, for example. Why is it that whenever there's a shift in the interest rates, all of the banks adjust their rates to exactly the same level? Yeah. Why is there not one bank saying, we are always going to set our prime lending rate at prime -1, so we'll always be 1% lower than the other banks? It's a business opportunity. Why don't they do it? It's collusion.
Is that simply a regulation failure?
No, it isn't. It's a lack of access to market opportunities in terms of how people are able to get in there, which is, so yes, at one level you can say that it's a regulation failure, because it's a failure to make it easy for new participants to enter the marketplace. Look, there are some things that we've done that are actually significant in recent times. So let me give you one very specific example. There was this idea that in terms of our shopping malls, you have this concept of anchor tenants. And the anchor tenants would generally put in place an agreement that if they happen to be in a shopping mall, then a competitor won't be there. So historically, if you go to any particular shopping mall, you would find a Pick and Pay, but not a Checkers, because that would be written into their contracts. And now we have a situation where the Competition Commission has determined that this is anti-competitive. Absolutely right. Because as far as I'm concerned, if I'm going shopping, if it so happens that the butter is cheaper at Checkers and the cheese is cheaper at Pick and Pay, I just want to be able to walk between shops as opposed to drive between shopping centers. So, as an example. So that's one of the scenarios where regulation would actually have been important. But most of the anti-competitive stuff that we have comes from this whole idea of national bargaining agreements that take place between particular industries. So you have very large manufacturing facilities that sit down with unions and then do wage determinations for the entire industry, which fails to take into account the possibility that a new player might want to enter the market. So let's say if I'm in the clothing industry, as an example, let's say I happen to be setting up in a place like Newcastle, which has, probably better than a 90% unemployment rate in that particular city. And I want to say I'm getting together a group of people, and we're going to start manufacturing clothing out here, and we're going to end up paying each other 2 Rand an hour, plus we're going to split the profits at the end of the year. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Because big business and big labor have gotten together, and they've taken a decision that you, as the person who is setting up this company, don't have the right to determine what you're able to afford to pay.
Yeah.
So all of these pieces come together.
So it's a classic oligopolies, which we've
10:45.
seen in other countries as well. I want to shift to global macroeconomics and the global outlook. And I want to start with what we've seen over the last 20 years in terms of globalism and these large multilateral trade deals, BRICS, TPP, NAFTA, I think it's now been renamed. Now we've been brought into BRICS. Do you see value in these global partnerships, or has it just been a mechanism to shift manufacturing jobs to certain regions? Honest question, what have we gained out of BRICS?
If you look in terms of what South Africa has gained out of BRICS right now, well, we've got access to the BRICS Bank, which theoretically means that our government is able to borrow more money to steal. So at that level, yes, we've gained something. Look, I think that BRICS right now, if in the broad scheme of things, it's actually only the middle part. It's Russia, India, China. And those three countries are essentially frenemies because they're competing in the same space at a number of levels. But at the same time, what they have very successfully been able to do is to create their own monetary system so that it's not dollar denominated. And that is hugely important because what it means is that you've been able to have the free flow of commerce between those three entities that is outside of the US banking system. Because the US, by controlling the banking system, effectively controls the global economy. So how does the US enforce the fact that we're not allowed to buy oil from Iran? Well, they do that by simply making it impossible for anyone to route payments across to Iran. So Russia, India, and China have actually been able to very successfully create a scenario where when India buys oil from Russia, for example, they're able to pay in rupees, and ditto in the case of China. And so there's all of these trade exchanges that are happening. Brazil has moved on a different direction because Brazil voted in a conservative government, and Brazil, in fact, very quickly ramped up its alliances with the United States during the Trump era. Now you've suddenly got the Biden era coming in again, and that's kind of upset the apple cart at some levels. So I don't know where that's going yet, but in South Africa is kind of like a flea on the larger dog of BRICS. Yeah. So we're bloodsuckers, but we're not really able to suck out the blood from the entire entity.
So looking at the smaller country and what the smaller country can do to protect itself in this era of globalization. Now, I made a video in 2019, which I theorized at that stage that I felt that Bitcoin could help these countries overcome the petrodollar or the US dollar as a global reserve currency. And we're starting to see it. We're seeing countries like Iran, Venezuela embrace it. So this is the proper segue to get into cryptocurrencies. Do you see that happening, and what's your view on the space? It's very interesting. It merges tech and economics, so it's very interesting space to a lot of us.
The interesting thing in terms of crypto is that it's highlighted the fact that the entire idea of fiat currencies is one of the biggest cons in terms of the human race. There's ever since we abandoned the gold standard, there's been a systematic destruction of wealth by governments who have just simply been able to print money. So if you consider, for example, what currently happens in the United States. So how does the United States actually do stimulus? Well, what they effectively do is they borrow money from the Federal Reserve and they inject it into the economy. But what is the security that they provide to the Federal Reserve? Well, they print a massive amount of money and they deliver that to the Federal Reserve as security for the money that they borrowed. So effectively, you're injecting something into the economy that doesn't have any real value. But the United States is the only country that is able to get away with doing this. And the reason for that is because the United States has insisted that you can only transact oil in US dollars. Now, when you have a scenario where the only way you're able to buy a barrel of oil means that you have to have US dollars, it means that every country in the world is forced to be part of it. Now, there's a couple of things that are actually shifting things away from that space. The single biggest thing that's going to cause the breakup of the US dollar is going to be the movement towards other energy sources, away from petroleum. And, you know, I don't think people have any idea right now what the impact of electric cars, just as a single category of thing, is going to have overall on the way in which the world monetary system actually runs. Because if the only reason why you needed to hold US dollars was to buy oil, and suddenly the global dependence on oil has actually shifted, what happens to the intrinsic value of the US dollar? You're not able to prop it up anymore. And at that level, the question then becomes, what then do people invest their money in that is actually going to give them at least the ability to stand still? Because remember, right now, you're always going backwards in terms of what your money is actually worth. So where do you actually put it so that you can be reasonably sure that it's not losing value? So during my grandfather's generation, it would be literally keeping gold coins under the mattress.
Yeah.
In many parts of the world, like South Africa, we're not allowed to own gold coins. Well, we could buy Krugerrands, but that's a crock because that's massively inflated in terms of its price. If you go to Abu Dhabi, you can literally walk up to a vending machine, put in your credit card, and get out a bar of gold. And the reason for that is because it's a store of wealth, and the governments there actually recognize it. Crypto is becoming that store of wealth, but remember that governments who rely upon the ability to be able to effectively steal your wealth through inflation and through taxation, once you have the ability to freely exchange money between individuals that is outside of reach of government, that is the single biggest threat to government around the world. And that's why you are seeing all of these crackdowns that are happening on an ongoing basis in terms of cryptocurrency. So what's going to happen in the long term is crypto is here to stay. Which cryptocurrency ends up being people's choice? I think there's going to be a basket of them, mainly because you need the ability to be able to pay for transactions quickly. The problem with Bitcoin right now is because verification of a transaction takes a minimum of 15 minutes. You're not going to be standing for 15 minutes in a shopping queue to ensure that the £5 that you've just spent on buying a handful of sweets is going to be processed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's, yeah.
I think my personal view is that Bitcoin will be seen as gold. You won't buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin. You will store your wealth and use it for large transactions, like maybe buying a house, and there will be a few others for other purposes. Do you see the 20s then being a period of potentially high inflation across global fiat currencies due to all of what we've discussed?
Well, I think that the interesting scenario that we've got right now is that if you look particularly in terms of the rand-dollar exchange rate, if you consider what a disastrous situation the South African economy is in right now, but at the same time, we've been able to maintain that roughly 15 to the dollar threshold. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? And the reason why that's the case, it's not that people actually have confidence in the rand. It's that people don't have any confidence in the US dollar anymore. And that has a ripple effect across all of the fiat currencies. So I'm answering your question kind of in a backward fashion, but I think that a larger number of people are becoming aware of the intrinsic lack of value that exists in the existing monetary systems. And that means that they are looking for alternatives
Yeah.
in terms of what they're doing.
One final question on the global affairs. What's your view on some of the censorship we're seeing across social media platforms? And we heard about the Great Reset. Is there something sinister brewing now post-COVID in the world?
Oh, absolutely. There's something sinister brewing, but that something sinister has been going around quite a while. Very interesting article in Time, actually, over the past week that talks about, if in any other scenario, this would be termed as conspiracy and collusion to effect regime change in the United States. But Time is now quite openly talking about how big tech came together with civil society and with unions in the US to do their damnedest to ensure that Trump was kept out of office. So it's out there in the open. Now, this is exactly the same type of thing where if China does it, then everyone gets furious about it. If India does it, everyone gets furious about it. But, it's okay for the United States to clamp down on particular trains of thought simply because of the fact that, this is going to encourage violence. I think what's going to happen is that there already has been a dramatic shaking of credibility in terms of your traditional sources of information. Now, consider this. Since the beginning of this year, CNN has lost 44% of its audience. And now ask yourself, why is that? And what are the explanations behind that? On the other hand, there are some vehicles like Fox News, for example, has actually increased its base. And that actually points to a crisis of credibility that's happening at a number of levels. You see places like YouTube now clamping down very firmly on trains of thought that don't agree with their global outlook. But at the same time, you are seeing more and more competitors coming up to places like YouTube. You're also seeing a scenario where there's an attempt to try and censor the internet at some level. So I don't know if you know that there's a website called Dear South Africa. Are you familiar with it?
No, I'm
Well,
not.
Dear South Africa is a group of people who essentially end up hosting petitions primarily around a range of things. So expropriation without compensation. There's a petition on Dear South Africa where you're able to make your submission, and they crowdsource those submissions, put them into a format that's suitable for being submitted to Parliament, and they do that. And they were taken offline this week by the Internet Service Providers Association, presumably for some violation of terms of service. Now, the entire idea that you have people who are meant to be providing you a pathway are able to shut off that pathway. It creates a scenario, though, where an increasing number of people are going to move into the dark web. Because, we don't have time to discuss what the dark web is all about here, but the entire idea is that you have encrypted end-to-end transactions where, because of the fact, even though they're traveling along the same internet lines, because no one is able to see what's actually going on in that particular transaction, they're not able to censor it. And I think that that's going to be an increasing view as people suddenly start taking responsibility for their own privacy at a level that they haven't done before. We saw this in terms of what happened with the Facebook WhatsApp debacle fairly recently. The sheer volume of people that switched to Signal and to Telegram, and Facebook is never going to be able to claw itself back from that credibility gap in terms of WhatsApp. And to this day, I'm still seeing everyday updates in terms of how to further protect your privacy from Facebook.
Once credibility is lost, it's gone.
Yeah, effectively. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to start wrapping up the discussion, and my closing thoughts, and then after this question, we can hear your general closing thoughts. But my closing thoughts is, we were a country that had Uh, we were starting to go into debt. We had the SOEs in crisis. All of this before COVID, and now we're trying to get out of COVID. If nothing changes in South Africa, what are the prospects for this country over the next decade?
It depends on which part of the country you're looking at and who in the country you're looking at. I think that you probably noticed that I haven't been on Twitter over the course of this year, simply because um, I just did an assessment and decided that was not a productive use of my time.
Well, no.
And so I've been pretty much off there. But as I was closing off last year, I said my slogan for 2021 is going to be defund the bastards. And the bastards in this case being our overlords who sit primarily in Luthuli House. And really what we need to do is we need to have a situation where we have a real democracy in this country. And we have a real democracy at the point at which Parliament becomes real. Parliament becomes real when the ANC is a minority party. So the ANC has to drop below 50%. If the ANC drops below 50%, the only way they're going to be able to pass any legislation or budget for that matter is with the cooperation of the other parties. So you're never going to have a situation, I think, if you look at their growth trajectory, where the DA is going to be the party that's able to rule the country. But you are going to have a situation where the DA is able to have substantial influence in terms of what gets passed. So it's either going to have to be the country is run by an alliance of the ANC and the likes of the EFF, or it's going to be a scenario where if the ANC wants to move in a more growth-oriented direction, then they'll need the cooperation of the DA to get legislation passed. So look at that as a future political model that's going to determine where the country goes. Until that time, I don't think that we're going to see any growth that's actually going to happen. Eskom is never going to be able to claw its way out of the debt hole that it is in right now. In fact, the view that I've expressed in the past is that Treasury should simply take the view that it should take the entire Eskom debt, absorb it into the Treasury, and write off the debt as part of the fiscus, rather than something that Eskom ever needs to make back. Reset Eskom to zero, slash electricity prices from there, and that will be the single biggest thing that will then be able to spark business growth. They're unlikely to do that, simply because these complicated SOE structures are there primarily as a means for our government to steal. And as long as we recognize that that is the business model for the African National Congress in its current incarnation, it is to have as many of these entities as possible and all of them funnel money back to the mothership, which is the ANC. They've learned well from the Chinese, which is why they're such good friends with the Chinese. For my part, what I'm quite determined to do is to spend as little money as I possibly can that's eventually going to make its way into the pocket of government.
Very interesting. Any final thoughts, closing thoughts before we end off?
I would suggest that everyone who can actually afford it start putting in place solar panels at their place and going off grid.
They're going to charge you for that now.
No, they can't charge you for the solar panels. What they can do is they can raise the amount of money that they are charging you to be connected to the grid. So in other words, it's kind of like, when you wanted an ADSL line at your home, but you still had to pay telecom rental for the fixed line costs coming to your room. That's the type of scenario that Eskom's looking at. But if you go onto Eskom's smallest pay-as-you-go type package, and you eventually replaced all of your light bulbs with LEDs, tossed out your electric stove and put in place gas stoves, all of these little things eventually mean that it's more money that's going into your pocket. You're still building residual value in your home, and you're not paying it out to government. And it's better investment than you could make sticking it into the JSE. The JSE has actually gone backwards in real money terms over the past several years.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Pillay, on that note, let's end it there. Thank you so much. We've gone a bit over the time. I certainly enjoyed our chat and I found it very interesting. Some very good points, especially, and I'll do a wrap because I like doing this for the viewers. You mentioned the need to improve public transportation as the number one thing that could get our economy going again. You mentioned that we don't really have a proper capitalism in this country. There are barriers to entry, monopolies, and that's also preventing economic growth. And you also mentioned aspiring to become a proper democracy as opposed to the current system. And those are 3 points that I made. So thank you for joining us today. And I think the viewers will most certainly have enjoyed this. And perhaps in the near future, we can have you on again.
Be a pleasure.
Okay, thanks, guys.